Hey guys, welcome to Amity Tracks. Now you eagle-eyed viewers here have probably noticed I am not in my usual location. I am in the beautiful wilds of Florida visiting some family, but that is not an excuse to miss an Amity Tracks episode. So I figured we'd film on location here, see how that works. But yeah, I'm in Florida, so obviously it makes sense to talk about Van Morrison. Actually, there's no connection at all. But so, we've been covering these divisive artists, right? I mean, we did a series on U2, did a series on Kiss, and it hasn't really been on purpose, but it's been kind of a fun theme that's been going, through recent episodes. And so I want to continue. I want to get into Van Morrison. I've got a lot of thoughts on Van Morrison. This is going to be about a 3-video series. We will, of course, get into an album ranking of Van Morrison in the next videos. But I call this video The Problem with Van Morrison. And Van Morrison, like some of these other artists we've covered, is a divisive artist, as most of you guys know. And he actually has been for quite a while. Now, a lot of his divisiveness has to do with politics, right? And I thought this would be an interesting way to address this issue of the role, or what role does politics, political views have in music and entertainment? Does it have a role at all? Is it smart to bring politics into it? Because you are going to alienate some of your audience. On this channel, I purposely don't address politics. It's just not something that I obviously have opinions and views like everybody else nowadays. And I admire, in fact, I'm a big fan of channels that do. And some of the channels I'm a fan of that bring in politics, they're on different parts of the spectrum here. I'm a big fan of Mazzy. He brings his political views into it. Andy Edwards, he brings his political views into it. And it's fine. In fact, I admire that. That's great. On this channel, I've chosen not to. The only time I'll bring politics in it, if it's relevant to the music we're talking about. If an artist is obviously getting on something political, got to talk about the politics a little bit. I try to keep my rants and personal views out of it. It's just kind of, I remember there was I was years ago on this channel, there was an episode where, I don't know, we're talking about something, or I was talking about something, and I just made some passing sarcastic political comment about something was going on at the time. And just, I mean, it was like clockwork in the comments. Just, half of the comments were about the politics and not about the music. And I actually, in the comments, actually apologized to some of the commenters that were getting on the politics. Like, I shouldn't have done that. I wanted to keep the focus on the music. It was kind of interesting. Then they responded. It's like, hey, I respect that too. It's just, I don't know. I've chosen to keep the politics out of it personally, unless it's obviously related to the music we're discussing. Now, does politics belong in music? I think it does. I've never bought into that, just, shut up and entertain us type of attitude. I think great art, great music addresses a lot of things. I would get bored if all the music I listened to was just, about I love you, baby, and whatever. I mean, look at the 1960s. I mean, some of those vital music that came out of that era, was protest music, political music. And I have never been one to cancel an artist, just personally, because of their political views. Two of my very favorite artists are Bruce Springsteen and Neil Young, and both of them have been very outspoken recently. And more power to you. That's great. Obviously, I'm also a fan of Van Morrison here, who, kind of been on a different side of some of these issues than, say, Neil and Bruce. More power to you, Van. So I don't ding an artist because they're being politically outspoken. I mean, I just don't. I know there are a lot of fans where they just that don't cross that line, but music is more important to me than politics. So it's not that way with some people, I think. Well, let's get into Van Morrison. I call this episode the problem with Van Morrison. And really, it's just, maybe it's clickbait title, I don't know. I just want to kind of bring you in and talk about some of these I guess, divisive issues surrounding Van Morrison. Also do kind of an introduction to Van Morrison, talk about him a little bit. I think I will cover Them, his early band in the 60s. We're going to knock that out in this episode. And then we can get into the rankings and, talk about the albums when I get back to my usual studio, so to speak. And I've got the records with me, and we can do the rankings. So why is Van Morrison divisive? Well, recently is politics, right? I mean, he was an outspoken critic of the COVID-19 restrictions. He was a huge outspoken critic of the restrictions on live performance. He was, he actually tried to break some of the laws in different, venues and areas, early on to try and perform even when he wasn't supposed to. He was one of the first to get out there and perform full time when they could. He's recorded, grumpy songs, about the restrictions on some of his more recent albums. Recorded some songs with Eric Clapton, one with similar views on that topic. They did some collaborations together. So, and again, I'll leave my own views out of it on all that stuff. But yeah, I'm fine if Van feels that way, and and that fuels his art. That is fine. But even before the politics, I mean, Van was a kind of a divisive figure, in music, right? I mean, renowned for decades and decades for his temper, his what comes across as arrogance, his dismissal of fans, and fan expectations. He's just kind of a legendary grumpy crank, right? And some people love him for that. I think the tag of difficult genius really does kind of fit for Van Morrison. I mean, the examples are myriad. He walked out of interviews angrily when he doesn't like the direction of the questions. He's infamous for being an indifferent performer. Sometimes not even speaking to the audience. Turning his back to the audience for long stretches of a show, kind of like Miles Davis used to do sometimes. I remember my dad. I mean, complaining about going to a Miles Davis show and the fact that Miles turned his back to the audience. It was unforgivable, according to my dad. And he'll cut shows short if he doesn't, something pisses him off, with the audience. Who knows? I mean, you should be honored to be in the very presence of Van Morrison. Seems to be the vibe, coming from Van, the stage. He's legendary for being not being real friendly with a lot of musicians, that he's played with. He does have some long time associations with certain musicians, but kind of all kinds of stories of him being short tempered in the studio and hesitant to even consider outside ideas. I mean, Bob Dylan, not the easiest guy, himself. I remember reading once he said, Van Morrison is one of the very few artists who intimidates him, right? That's Bob Dylan. And there's all kinds of stories. I mentioned Andy Edwards before. I don't know if you ever watch Andy Edwards' channel. You should. He's awesome. But he'll remind you several times in a video that he used to play drums for Robert Plant. and Andy told this story about Van Morrison on his channel one time, which is just so Van Morrison. It's great. He was talking about playing this, I don't know, sometime in the 90s when Andy was drumming for Robert Plant. And Plant was playing some festival. And Van Morrison was also playing the festival. And Andy and a lot of the other musicians were hanging around in the, backstage waiting area, VIP area, whatever. And Van arrives, for his set. And, Van Morrison's people, his people kind of walk into the VIP area, the tent or whatever, and basically tell people, Mr. Morrison is arriving. He's going to be walking in, going to the stage. Nobody can talk to Mr. Morrison. Please don't speak to Mr. Morrison. Please don't look at Mr. Morrison in the eye. And Andy's a great storyteller. He tells it a lot better. But he basically talks about this real awkward scene where, we're talking about other musicians. I don't know if Robert Plant was even there, right? But everyone sort of parts like the Red Sea, to make room for Van Morrison as he strode in, and Van, didn't crack a smile, didn't look at anybody, didn't say a word, and just walked through up to the stage, did his set, walked back, and left. And it's like, it's Van Morrison, right? One of my other favorite stories goes way back. The Revenge Songs story, which some of you guys may know this. Them, and again, we're going to talk about them at the end of this video, but his first band, really, or his first band that got, recorded stuff and all that, had been produced by Burt Burns, kind of one of those notorious kind of, impresario, producers. I believe Burns dies probably in 1967, somewhere around there. And Burt Burns' widow sort of, inherited control over, the company and the artists that are that were assigned to him. And, Van Morrison was, leaving or left them, was getting into a solo career and wanted to be free from under the control of the Burt Burns empire, and wanted to sign to Warner Brothers. And so Warner Brothers basically bought out his contract from the widow, but part of the deal was he still owed that company 36 songs. And so, in one of the greatest sort of, giving the middle finger to the man, moves in music, so Van goes in and records, 36 songs in one day, to deliver to the old company. And, they've been released. You can hear them. They're awesome. He just goes in with an out-of-tune acoustic guitar and just bangs out BS. There's a song about ringworm. My favorite is a song called Want to Danish. Yeah, I've actually written down the lyrics to Want to Danish. Van Morrison, renowned lyricist, deep lyricist. Here's the lyrics to Want to Danish. You want a Danish? No, I just ate. I've just eaten. Do you want, I want some bread up front. Oh, bread up front. You want a sandwich? Have a Danish. Want a sandwich? Have a sandwich. Have a seat. Have a seat. Have a sandwich. Have a Danish. Just ponder those lyrics for a minute. Deep. Sounds like haiku. Anyway, so it's just one of the great stories, right? He just delivers these stupid, unusable songs just to get out of this contract. But of course, they have been released. You can hear them. Among Van Morrison fans, it's become like a badge of honor to be told off by Van Morrison. There's myriad stories of people that have bumped into him in a pub or on an airplane or whatever, gone up to him and, asked for an autograph, or I just want to tell you what your music has meant to me. And invariably the story ends with Van, just looking at him and just saying, F off. And it's become kind of like, Van Morrison told me to F off. It's become a badge of honor, right? Which is, it's a striking contrast, because Van's music, at its best, can be so deep and spiritual and open and warm. You listen to that music and, tying it to this person, that people have come to know. It's fascinating. But yeah, the grumpy genius tag. I think we've covered the grumpy. Let's talk about the genius real quick. I do think Van Morrison is a genius. That name is, in the music realm. That tag has been thrown around way too easily, but I think Van qualifies. At his best, he's been up there, I think, close to Dylan, close to these other artists. Lyrically, very complex, very spiritual, very fascinating. Take you to these very deep spiritual places. Can also be very joyful and playful. Vocally, what do you say about Van Morrison's voice? In different eras, it's changed, but he's sort of maintained through a lot of his career. I wouldn't say he's as great now, but he's how old is Van Morrison? He's old, but through decades and decades, even as it changed, he was one of the tops. That voice. I think that's also been kind of a weakness for him, is he was so supernaturally talented as an artist, as a creative, as a vocalist. Also, great musician too. Some people don't realize. good saxophonist. He can play guitar. He can play a lot, harmonic, really good harmonica player. He can play a lot of great instruments too, or instruments very well, I should say. But I think that's been one of his weaknesses, in more recent decades, is that reputation, that talent is so huge that he has been able to kind of coast a little bit. He's sort of coasted on that reputation, his past, his voice, and I don't know if I want to say lazy, but there's a sameness about, I don't know, the last 25, 30 years of Van Morrison records, to me, or he just sort of gets into a pattern, and he can just kind of do his thing because he's Van Morrison. Yeah. Anyway, that's kind of my take on it. So anyway, it's kind of fun just talking a little bit about Van Morrison because he's a fascinating figure. Well, let me tell you, I want to cover them. Let's talk about them real quick. We'll do that at the very end, but let me just tell you how this series will work. I'm not going to rank his entire discography. That would be, if you're just looking at studio records, that would be 47 records by my count. I'm not going to rank 47 records of Van Morrison. So I'm going to stick with the 20th century, from 1967, when he started as a solo artist. I believe it was 67. 67, his first solo album, through 1999. So, the 20th century. There's several reasons. One, again, I just don't want to rank 47 albums, especially his 21st century output. One, I'm not as familiar with it. I'm going to be honest with you. I've listened to it. It's just, to me, there's something that's kind of been lost. There's kind of a sameness to it. The grumpiness has come way more into the fore. Kind of this sort of R&B rut in a lot of these records. And, I'm sure there are gems in there. So I'm not declaring myself an expert on 21st century Van Morrison. I'm not. I've like I said, I've listened to some of it, but I'm just not as familiar with it. And it just, so we're going to rank the 20th century Van Morrison. Okay. He's been as prolific as Neil Young, right? And so, with such inspiring titles as 2021's latest record project, Volume 1. That's kind of what he's, named some of these records. But anyway, so I'm ranking 26 studio records. Okay, we're going to do 26 records from 1967 to 1999, his 20th century output. So I got about 2 more episodes probably. So my next episode will be 26 through 11. And then we'll tack on discussion of important compilations. Because there actually are. There is one compilation in particular that I think is one of the greatest and most important compilations in the history of compilations. And so we'll address that in the next episode as well, along with the 26 through 11. And then the final episode will be the top 10, my top 10 Van Morrison records. And then we can also tack on the discussion of his live output, the live albums. Because in my opinion, there are 2 absolutely essential live Van Morrison records. One, everyone knows what I'm going to talk about, but the other one, I don't think is talked about as much, and I want to talk about that as well. So that's kind of what we have ahead. Well, let's take a few minutes before I wrap up here in this beautiful locale, and talk about them, right? So, them was his kind of first big band, not big band jazz, but band that got kind of big, formed in 1964. And, one of those, was Irish, right? But, one of those sort of British Isles, we'll say, plus Ireland. I don't want to get into that. But, one of those bands from overseas that took American roots, roots musics like, R&B and blues, turbocharge it, repackage it, sell it back to us, right? But also we're big over there. And what really, although some really good musicians in them. I like the band, actually. But obviously what really distinguished them was this amazing vocalist and leader, Van Morrison, right? That was their weapon. And some essential songs. I still put some of the Them tracks as some of the most essential Van Morrison songs. I believe they released 2 records with Van Morrison before he took off, to do his own thing, of course. He was never going to last in a band setting. But they did two great records. Although, as is the case over there at the time, a lot of the great songs were singles that were not on the records, right? That's how that works. So honestly, if you really want to dig into them, I mean, just find a good compilation. There are a lot of compilations out there, you know, like this one. I brought this one with me to show. You know, I've got one or two on vinyl too, but I didn't bring those with me. But you know, them featuring Van Morrison. I mean, Gloria. And that is one of the key. If that's all he had done and quit, I mean, you know, he'd still be discussed occasionally. I mean, because that is one of the key kind of garage rock classics, right? Gloria, but it has some great stuff. Mystic Eyes, Baby Please Don't Go. You know, that turbocharged cover is killer. Here Comes the Night, which is actually credited to Burt Burns. My Lonely Sad Eyes. I'm just kind of looking at track listing here. You know, Don't Look Back, a John Lee Hooker song, I believe. It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. The cover of the Bob Dylan song is just transformative. I've always talked about it. You know, I only like covers if they're really transformative. And them's version of It's All Over Baby Blue, I think, is gorgeous. I mean, you know, that was, of course, sampled in that by Beck. Anyway, I don't have anything in front of me. But one of Beck's hits actually sampled them's version, you know, some of the music of them's version from It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. Gorgeous, gorgeous song. So it's worth tracking down some of these them songs. But anyway, so there you go. So next time, you know, we'll get into the ranking. Like I said, 26 through 11 in comps, and then the one after top 10 and live albums. That's what we kind of have, you know, to look forward to in our Van Morrison series here. So please do in the comments. Let's talk Van Morrison. What do you guys think? And just the general topic of, you know, how do you feel about artists, you know, bringing in their politics in their music, or, you know, on stage going off on a rant, or in an interview, or whatever. You know, how do you feel about that? You know, I think it's an interesting topic to discuss. And then we can talk about Van Morrison also in the comments. How do you feel about Van Morrison? What are your views on Van Morrison in general? And then we'll get into the rankings. All right, we'll see you guys next time, and we'll be back in my music room.